So yeah, pleasure to be here. I think a number of the people here I've seen across in different advocacy circles, and I'm aware there's quite a lot of advocacy, evidence-based advocacy already happening in the sarcoma patient community. But hopefully I can share my perspective, and I'll try and stick to time because I think the questions and answers at the end are as interesting, if not more interesting, than anything I've got to say. So firstly, what is evidence-based advocacy?
Sorry, excuse me. For some reason, we don't have the full slide. We only see half of the slide.
How strange.
At least I did.
Let me stop the screen share and try it, because otherwise it will not be particularly fun if you can't see.
We can guess the other half.
maybe that half will be more interesting. Who knows? There. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Now?
Yes, now it's fine. Thank you.
Oh, how strange. Okay, so evidence-based advocacy. Sharing here WeCan, which is obviously the work group of European Cancer Advocacy Networks, the definition of what evidence-based advocacy is. And evidence-based advocacy is about not necessarily rigorous scientific evidence in the same way as we've heard from our previous speaker, but about how you as patient advocates can use evidence in your advocacy work to improve the effectiveness of what you're trying to do and to make sure you're acting in a way that is based on what people are actually experiencing rather than individual perspectives. So let me move on to why you would use evidence. And for me, there's two main reasons why to use evidence. The first of which is credibility. People will believe you. Now, we'll go into how you make sure the things you're trying to convince people of are actually valid in a moment, but actually one of the main reasons to use evidence is if you've got evidence to back up your point of view, people are more likely to believe that your point of view is the correct point of view to hold. We heard at the beginning definitions of what evidence and proof and various standards may be, but for me, that's only half of the story as to why you should use evidence as an advocate. And the second half is understanding. So we as patient advocates, we as any secondary source of information, so if we try and represent a large group of patients, all we can ever understand is our individual perspective. We may hear from many patients who have similar perspectives. We may hear from patients who have different perspectives, but the only way truly to understand multiple perspectives and make sure you're gathering all of them is to ask people about them and gather that as evidence. So the slide you've got here, you can see on the left-hand side is a secondary source. You're looking on at something, and that's your perspective. On the right-hand side is the perspective of the baby, if you actually understand. And when we think about this in the context of clinical trial design, actually, if we use patient-reported outcome measures that don't ask about the things that matter to the patients who are part of the trial, we're measuring whether those things change. But what we're not actually doing is we're not measuring the things that impact on the daily lives of the patients, the things that actually matter to them. In the context here, you could quite easily turn around the angle of the toys and suddenly it'd be a much better baby toy. The same kind of thing is true in clinical trial design. If we understand the things that matter to patients, we can design treatments to meet the things and change the things that matter to patients. So for me, I think there's a huge responsibility on the patient community to use evidence when we're trying to advocate for change. I'm not going to go into any of the detail of these bits because I pick up on them later, but there's a whole range of ways organisations can use evidence. And the thing I would stress here is, I can talk here about a patient survey we did of over 2,000 leukemia patients in the UK. Evidence-based advocacy doesn't have to be that. Evidence-based advocacy can be proportionate to what you're trying to achieve. Sometimes it might be a really niche point and you're collecting information from a few small number of patients to kind of inform something. Sometimes it can be validated, large-scale statistical analysis survey. It really has to be proportionate. So when we're thinking about how to use evidence, this is just perhaps something that's really obvious, but I think is worth saying. Listen to the evidence and act on what the evidence is telling you. Do not just think, I already know something, let me go and gather some evidence on that. Great, I've now got evidence from my perspective. And that's where I say the two kind of reasons to use evidence. Credibility, you can collect evidence to back up your existing point of view, but genuinely with the understanding, listen to what the evidence says. If the evidence disagrees with what you previously thought, understand why that is. Is it flaws in how the data was collected, or did you think the wrong thing in the first place? And really here, methodology is key. As patient advocates, we've tried to publish evidence for a number of years, and increasingly we're seeing evidence published in the large scientific journals that's coming out from patient advocacy organisations. And the reason it's taken so long to get there is in the past, a lot of the methodologies we were using were enough to show there might be something going on, but not enough to rigorously, scientifically check and critique what we were saying. So actually your finding may not be the thing that gets critiqued. The thing that gets critiqued is how you went about gathering that data. And it's really a shame as the patient community when in many cases we're trying to bring a challenge to what the clinical data says, where we go, that's all very nice, but it's not what matters to patients. If your evidence you're bringing to change that can be easily challenged on the basis of methodology, it's really disappointing. So that's why it's worth getting it right, if that makes sense, worth putting in the time in advance and saying, okay, is the way I'm going to run this going to show what I actually want to understand and what I want to get out of it? And again, similarly, when you're interpreting evidence at the end, does the thing you're saying your evidence shows, is that actually what your evidence shows? The difference between anxiety and depression, two very, very different things. If we ask a question that says, were you worried about? And then you start using terms like anxiety and depression, they're not the same thing as worry. You have to be very, very careful in saying the thing you are interpreting the evidence to say, is that actually what it says, or is it a nice to have something around the backgrounds? Did you ask that question? Did you ask the right people? Did you ask the right subgroup of patients whether they're worried about something before you start saying a different subgroup thinks X, Y, or Z? Did you actually ask enough people? Did you ask, if it's the whole of sarcoma, did you ask hundreds of patients? If it's a particular subgroup, did you ask a representative sample of that size of the subgroup? And I won't go too much into this because this could take us an entire talk in itself, but there's a kind of a principle for how to follow evidence, and broadly I would break it down into 3 steps, and each of those steps has 2 parts, so you can kind of cut these 6 steps into groups of 2. And the first stuff is before you ever decide to run a survey, looking into the strategy and the research and what it is that you want to look into, and then designing a questionnaire based on that. I'll go into some of these following, so don't worry too much. Then when you're actually running the survey, there's the implementation elements, the actual conducting of the survey, which is the bit that people normally have in mind with the survey and is actually by far the easiest part of it. And then the third part is the analysis, the publication, the communication of your findings. Broadly, I would say each of these, if you're running a large-scale patient survey, should take around 6 months. Now, if you're going to do a relatively small scale or proving a point, such as some of the COVID surveys that a number of groups have run over the last year or so, clearly an 18-month project is not proportionate to what you're trying to do. And in many cases, some of these surveys have been designed and run certainly in weeks, if not in days. But I would say it's worth allocating at least as much time to the design and analysis of your findings as it is the period you run the survey itself. It's really easy to think you can pull together a quick questionnaire and just send it out. And usually you have more problems than answers when you do it that way. So it's worth investing the time up front. When you're investing the time up front and saying, let's run a survey, be really clear what it is you want to run a survey on. What do you want to know? And the way I like to think about this is, when I have the findings, what do I want to be able to say? I want to be able to say, I understand X, Y, or Z, or I can prove this number of patients are experiencing this particular issue. And if you want to say that at the end, make sure that's what you're saying in the beginning and feeding back from that. So in trying to work out what it is you might want to say at the end, think about what are you trying to achieve. And this is where I say the difference between evidence-based advocacy and just scientifically generating evidence. If you want to convince a politician to make a particular decision, or you want to make a particular funding body make a particular decision, think about what are they going to want to be shown in order to convince them to make that decision. Think about what evidence already exists. If it's a new drug about an existing clinical trial, what evidence have they already collected? Don't bother collecting any of that. You don't need to. Think about what the evidence gaps are, what types of evidence are going to be convincing to the people you want to convince, and work backwards from that way. So as a general rule of thumb, and this is kind of my adaptation of a particular psychological technique called the Johari window, which if you're interested, go and read far more about it. But think about what evidence already exists. So think about whether it's already known. Firstly, is it known to you? Secondly, is it known to others? And if it's known to you and known to others, it already exists. Don't bother doing anything. Just use that as an evidence base, use the resource, reference it. If it's known to others, but not known to you, you should find that out by doing some simple desk research. You can do that in a more methodological way if you want to prove and say, these are all the sources that already exist externally. If it's known to you and not known to others, i.e. you think patients are experiencing a particular issue, and you want to be able to prove that, or you want to be able to quantify how many patients are experiencing that particular issue, use quantitative projects such as surveys. So you can say 83% of patients say X, Y, or Z. And then one of the most interesting types, and quite often scientifically not viewed as particularly interesting, is when it's not known to you and it's not known to others. And this is the stuff, this is the golden nugget stuff. And that's why I say understanding is so important, because until you know the stuff you don't know, you can't possibly understand. And the only way of picking up things like this is in focus groups and individual patient interviews, because you can't ask a survey question about a topic you don't know is an issue. And the last thing I would really say here is sometimes as patient advocates, what's known to us is not the same as what's known to the rest of the community, and have that in mind when you're deciding what isn't already known and proven. So this is just building on what I've already kind of said before, which is if it's things you want to quantify, surveys are generally a good way of doing it. If it's about understanding things you don't already know, you can do that through surveys. You can do it through open-ended text box, for example, where people can share their experiences, but it's also more interesting sometimes to do it through focus groups. So if someone says something and you go, oh, that's new, I didn't know that, you can ask follow-up questions, you can dig slightly further and detailed into it. So coming back to the thing I said really at the beginning about evidence generation, think about what it is you want to do with it. Don't just generate evidence for the sake of it. These kind of projects, and particularly if you're making them methodologically sound, can take a lot of time and they can take a lot of money. So do it about the things you want to have the evidence on. Don't just do a survey that asks about everything to do with patient experience, where your findings are going to be debunked because your methodology doesn't make any sense at all. Be really serious about what it is you want to understand the evidence for and work backwards from that. So I've talked about patient generation of evidence quite a lot, but it's also worth noting here, patient involvement doesn't mean that patients are always the one leading the project. Part of generating evidence on the patient perspective is advocating in other settings, such as on clinical trial steering committees, and making sure the evidence created by other stakeholders meets the needs of the patient community. And anyone who ever says we don't know how to do it, just point them in the direction of the roadmap from multiple advocates that's worked out a process and the opportunities for involvement. So a case study of doing some of this from an advocacy perspective, and again, I say think about proportion. For some of the organisations on this call, running a survey that can reach 2,300 something patients and costs tens of thousands of pounds, which one of these surveys did, that might not be proportionate. But equally, we've run Survey Monkeys and Google Forms that have reached just as many patients. So it is debatable as to what you want to spend the money on, and it depends what you want to do with that. And obviously, if you haven't got the money to spend in the first place, then your options become more limited. So the purpose of this project was to explore the patient experience of leukemia patients in different parts of the UK, with different types of leukemia at different points in their patient pathway. So we designed a questionnaire that followed the journey from the point of diagnosis and asked questions up to wherever they were in their patient journey, which is a term I really don't like, but is the simplest way of describing it. In order to make sure the questionnaire was asking the right things of patients beyond us just thinking we were asking the right question, we tested it with a group of different patients multiple times with different types of leukemia, different demographic backgrounds, and we refined the content and did interviews with them to make sure that all of the answer options they wanted to give to any of the questions were available. So you weren't asking a question to which their response, they tick don't know, but it wasn't because they didn't know, it was because none of your answer options were suitable. Because that's where you're missing things. That's where focus groups and surveys work really nicely alongside each other. We've also run this survey multiple times across different time points so that we can compare between the different versions and see how the situation is changing over time, which can be really useful from an advocacy perspective, because you can say to stakeholders, politicians, etc., you're responsible for this and it's not getting any better, or it's in fact getting worse. And we're actually looking to do something like this again to map up what's changed in the context of COVID. This one was actually really interesting because in the UK, what you can do is you can get past the age-old, all of the patients who come out to patient advocacy groups are not your average patient. You only reach out to those who are particularly vocal or who particularly need support. One of the things we did in this project was we were able to access the NHS data set for their annual cancer patient experience survey and send it as a follow-up, so we could compare between patients who came through a patient group and came through through the CPES survey, which is a conversation for another time, because I could do a whole presentation just on that, because it's fascinating and worth reading the report if anyone's really interested in that section. And then the last thing to say from a case study is, what are the outputs that you want out of it? And again, this is where I say think from the beginning about what you want to do with it, because that influences the type of questions you're going to ask and how you're going to present it at the end. So we've used this project in a variety of ways. We've published a report with all of the findings, which is about 100 pages, and there's much more that we couldn't fit in the report. We've presented it in various places, whether that's launching it in the House of Parliament, presenting it at various conferences in oral presentations and in posters on particular subsets of the data. But most interestingly, we've actually used it to investigate some of these things further. So we took the known issues, ran a survey on them, as I've said, and then we took the bits that were interesting that came out of it, and we ran follow-up focus groups with representative group of patients and said, okay, so why are you answering the way that you're answering? Because that was really interesting. These were the things we didn't think we knew beforehand, and trying to understand and delve into those issues slightly further. So I'm going to move finally on to, I've talked a lot about generation and opportunities of weighing of evidence, but how you can actually then take this evidence for use in your advocacy activities. And there's lots of different ways, and I'm going to go through some of them fairly quickly. Hopefully the slides will be shared later if anyone wants to refer back to any of these things. I'm more than happy for them to be so. So the first one is defining unmet needs. I've talked through this a lot already, which is the understanding things you might not already know, quantifying known issues, seeing how many patients are experiencing these things, understanding how they vary between particular groups. So it might be parts of a country, it might be different types of your particular cancer type, it might be time since diagnosis, it might be age group, it really depends on what the factor is. And it's really interesting when someone asks me, what do patients think of X, Y, or Z? Because the answer I can guarantee is always, it depends, because it depends on one of those factors. Younger patients may think this, older patients may think this. And I hate when people send me a survey, like for a pre-meeting or something, and what would patients think about this topic? Because I always send an email and say, I'm not filling in your survey, because it's really not helpful. One of the things we've done at Leukemia Care in the UK with this survey is we've said, okay, we're a patient organisation, our board are patients, we're here for the mission of patients. Is what we're doing the thing that patients want us to be doing? So we've taken the survey, which had nearly 100 questions, a report which had about 100 pages with a series of recommendations, and we've used those recommendations to inform our organisational strategy and say, okay, how do the things we think we're doing map back against the things patients tell us are the issues that are affecting their daily lives, and say our recommendations are each being addressed. That doesn't mean you as the organisation is solving them necessarily, but your work might be to campaign on an issue to get somebody else to solve that issue, or it might be to provide support for it yourself as an organisation. And one of the other things is with evidence, you don't have to do it once. You can then use performance measures, capturing metrics as you go along to say, how are you doing towards achieving that goal? We've also used it to identify potential needs that we've had that came out of the survey to then design new services for support. Evidence from a patient survey is absolutely brilliant for a funding application to say, look, this is an issue patients are experiencing. This is how many patients are experiencing this issue. Will you please give me some money to fund a service so I can actually try and solve it? Because we all know that one of the biggest issues when we're trying to complain to funders is actually convincing them the thing we're doing is worthwhile in the first place. And again, use metrics, indicators as part of that project to report back and say, this percentage of patients said they didn't understand their diagnosis. Following this new project, this hopefully improved percentage of patients so they do understand their diagnosis when given better information, better support, etc., etc. We also used this and other evidence-based sources to inform some of our campaigning. So it might be awareness campaigning to the public. And I picked this particular example to say, think about your audience. Think about if you were communicating a campaign to a patient group, what do they know? If you're communicating your campaign to a public audience, what do they already know about sarcoma? And more importantly, what do you want them to know about sarcoma? So following this and a couple of other surveys that we did alongside it, one of the things we understood was that people actually knew the word leukemia. They might not know what it was, but we'd already reached the public awareness level. We know over 90% of people know and use the term. What we wanted to communicate was leukemia is a form of cancer, cancer of the blood. It's not a childhood disease. It affects people of all ages. And here are the common symptoms you should be aware of. We scrapped all the rest of the messaging and said, focus on the things we actually want the public to know. And you can use the same in your advocacy activities. If you want to influence a politician, think about what they need to know to change their decision. Don't tell them everything you want them to know about sarcoma all in one go, because they go, okay, thanks, that's really interesting. Tell them the issue is X. Here is the evidence I have to back up that issue. This is what I would like you to do with that evidence, and only tell them the relevant stuff. I won't do the next one because it's a similar one and we're running out of time, I think, and I want to leave time hopefully for a question or two. But my final slide is particularly in the context of health technology appraisals, because I know this is something that's hugely growing and something that a lot of groups want to create evidence about. In most cases, the consideration of patient evidence is qualitative, so it's really difficult for us to understand how we impact on decision making because it's not part of the model. You can create quantitative evidence, such as patient surveys, patient registries even. At the moment, it is really difficult to do that in certain parts of the world to even be listened to. In parts of the world, such as NICE, where we are perhaps more inclusive, the question is still, how do you use your evidence to generate advocacy impact? For me, it's not about necessarily trying to influence the overall model, because a lot of that comes outside of the evidence generated by the patient community at the moment. But what we do is we think about the things that make a difference to the decision making. So in the UK, that's the QALY. What influences the cost effectiveness ratio in the UK? In other areas, what will influence the public's politician decision, et cetera, et cetera. And in the UK, you can actually get the list of what those are because it's in the economic modelling. Focus your advocacy impact on those topics. What are the things that make a difference to the decision? And in many cases, those will be the things that will be uncertain, because that's why they make a difference to the decision. Generate evidence on them. Generate what patients think about. So what percentage of patients are likely to proceed to a transplant? That's often hotly debated. Ask your patient community. That's answer the question, answer the things that are uncertainties, and answer them. What do patients think of X? Do patients think there is a value from this? Ask them. Provide that evidence. So I will end there with my final slide, because I didn't really stick to time, like I said I would do at the beginning. But if I can summarize it, generate the evidence on the things you want to say at the end, ask those questions, and then say that.
Thank you, Zack.